All right. So thank you for sticking around with us. We've got Annie Evans here from the University of Richmond, as well as the Virginia Geographic Alliance. And she's part of the New American History kind of project. I don't know, is it called project or just New American
Yeah,
History?
just New American
Based
History's
out of
fine
the
too.
University of Richmond. And so she's going to talk to us about the Valley of the Shadow version 2.0, NextGen Digital Humanities Inquiries. And the screen is
Well, thanks
yours.
everybody. Thank you, Josh, for having me. As I was saying in the last session, for those of you that are, if you're tuning in virtually, you may have already listened to the last session. Maybe you didn't, but I was in person at the Tennessee conference last year. I enjoyed it very much. And New American History comes out of the imagination of our director, Ed Ayers, who is actually a Tennessee graduate. He grew up in Kingsport. His mama taught fifth grade there for over 35 years. So in a little bit, this is sort of a homecoming for our project to be presented here tonight with all of you fine folks. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about a new version. We have rebuilt the original Valley of the Shadow project. We envision it as the Valley of the Shadow version 2.0 for a new generation of learners, looking at the next generation of digital humanities inquiries. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about digital humanities projects. I'm going to share a few of the projects that we have at New American History, mainly focusing on the Valley of the Shadow, but I will show you a couple of others. In the last session, Josh just did an amazing session. I hope you will go back and listen to it if you weren't there live, where he talked a lot about historical inquiry and the types of historical thinking skills that we want our students to be using. So I will try and honor that work as well. There was some great talk in the chat in the previous section on having kids look for patterns and asking good questions. And we're all about that at New American History. So I hope that there'll be something for everyone in this session. That's just me. You can read that later if you have insomnia. This is, I like to call this slide our why. This is a slide that sort of encapsulates the things that we are thinking about as we are creating new maps, creating new digital humanities projects, creating learning resources revolving around those projects, going into schools and presenting lessons, which I am available to do through Zoom. I'm constantly going in and piloting our new learning resources or doing presentations for kids between grades 4 through 12 and on up into community college and four-year institution level undergrad courses. So these are the things that I sort of think about. And I'm wondering for those of you who are here live, and if you're playing along at home later on, I'm wondering if there's anyone who's willing to maybe say something about one of them that might speak to them, one of these bullet points. So we'll see if we can get a little audience participation going here. So any of these resonate with you, or these things that you're thinking about as you are working on your lessons each week? You can just unmute yourselves. You have a shy group.
And I'm looking at the chat, so if you want to chat there, and I can read it out loud as well.
All right, well, maybe we'll revisit.
Well, we got one that said, "Oh,
great.
they're starting to come in now."
Oh,
They had to
good.
take some time to read.
Yeah.
Time to have discourse is a challenge for me. These are definitely practices I try to use in my lessons.
Great. Thank you. All right, well, maybe we'll revisit these a little towards the end as you get more familiar with the tools and the resources. So just a little quick history lesson here. So Dr. Ayers was a young associate professor at the University of Virginia. And around 1992, 1993, when Netscape was the first public browser that was sort of out there for everybody, he was an early adopter of thinking about ways that the internet could be used for humanities instruction. People made fun of him. People warned him at UVA. They said, Ed, why are you playing with that internet thing? Nobody's ever going to use it and you won't get tenure. And he said, I disagree. He said, I think it has great potential, and I'm going to fully explore and use it to the best, that I can imagine. And so he immediately, instead of lecturing to his students in his U.S. History Survey courses there at the University of Virginia, he immediately started engaging them in researching, scanning thousands of images, maps, letters, diaries, newspapers, public records, focusing in on two communities in the Civil War, one in the North and one in the South. This eventually was put out, remember CD-ROMs? Eventually it was put out as a book, a companion book with CD-ROMs that included these before it became a live website here at the University of Virginia. And then he ended up writing two books, and people always laugh at he took a little time in between those two books. But the first one, The Presence of Mine Enemies, and then many years later, when he was finishing up his tenure at University of Richmond, he came out with kind of the second half of the story, The Thin Light of Freedom. And all of those sort of encapsulate the work that he did on this Valley of the Shadow project. Right around the same time, I was a beginning teacher. I had only been in the classroom for a couple of years, and I went to a National Geographic sponsored workshop at Virginia Tech, where a young Annie Evans, very early in her career, saw Netscape for the first time. At that same time, I also saw very early GIS software. A professor was sharing with us some digital maps that he was creating to push out for K-12 use. They were very basic. They weren't the greatest of maps, but I was immediately hooked between looking at things on the internet and looking at these maps. And that fall, I went to our state social studies conference, and a young professor named Ed Ayers was presenting there. And that's where I first saw the Valley of the Shadow. So I begged my principal to give me some of the old beat up computers that were previously only allowed to be used in the math and science lab. And he gave me 5, and my students would do anything. They would get their work finished. They would do whatever I asked so that they could have a little time to go sit in the back of the room and pour through these letters and diaries and maps and newspapers and learn about the lives of the people and the soldiers living in the North and the South during the Civil War. They were very interested in this topic, particularly because I taught in Richmond, Virginia, which, as we know, is the capital of the Confederacy. And so they had only heard of the Civil War through the lens of Virginia history. Seeing how people felt in the northern area. So Augusta County, Virginia was the city in the South that Dr. Ayers picked in the Shenandoah Valley, and Chambersburg, Pennsylvania was the place that he picked in the North. And so my students were very quickly wrapped up into the stories and wanting to know what happened before, during, and after the war as it was presented through all of these public records and documents and primary sources. This is a short clip. I don't know if the bandwidth is great here. This is part of an hour-long lecture that Dr. Ayers gave at the American Civil War Museum, which is a museum that he helped put together here in Richmond, Virginia. I hope if you make your way towards Richmond, Virginia, if you're passing through, you'll take a little time to stop, because it is unlike any Civil War museum you've probably ever visited before. It really, truly does present the ideas and the mindsets and the points of view and the narratives of, I think it does a great job balancing the Northern and Southern perspectives and the perspectives of women, the enslaved, and others. And it's a very, very unique learning space. They do a great job with student groups, and also they work with the local colleges, and they provide opportunities for students to do things like transcription projects where they're transcribing primary source documents to be digitized. During the pandemic, they did a lot of really great outreach into the schools digitally, and they've maintained all those digital outreach resources. So it's a rich resource. If you're studying the Civil War in general, you can go to their website. But this is a lecture that Dr. Ayers gave all about the original Valley of the Shadow. And I have a short clip of it that's embedded into the learning resource that we'll take a look at here in a while. But I encourage you to watch the whole thing if you have time. It's very fascinating. It goes a little bit more into the history of how he started the project and how it was created. This is an early project. So one of the first things that Dr. Ayers, after he was a professor at UVA for, I think it was over 2 decades, he came to the University of Richmond to be the university president. One of the first things he did was establish the Digital Scholarship Lab. And that's where I work most closely with the folks there. And this is a project that is called the Historical Atlas. What they did was they took the Pollen Atlas, which was a historical atlas, and they digitized it. And so you can see here, this is the table of contents, and I'm going to come out of presenter mode so I can actually take you to the live atlas. You go into the table of contents, and what they've done is they geo-rectified these paper maps over top of a digital atlas. So for every topic that you see here, so for example, I'm just going to click on military history. You see all these maps that were in the original paper. Since we're talking about Valley of the Shadow, I'm going to go ahead and pick Civil War. It takes you out to the map, laid on top of the geo-rectified plate there. You can add in the table of contents, and you can add in text. So your students are able to go through and read the text from the original map and see the maps digitally, so that it's not just some book in a dusty corner of an archive or the stacks of a college library somewhere. All of your students can access this resource free of charge, and they can kind of look at how was history being taught and portrayed. So I love to start kids off looking at these sort of stagnant maps, right, before we go into some of the digital maps that we're using today, using things like GIS software. So I think it's a fascinating way for kids to look at not only how far we've come along with cartography, particularly with digital humanities, but also looking at like what kind of stories could these older maps tell, and then compare them to the types of stories we can tell through maps and digital humanities today. So that's one site, and everything is linked in the presenter notes for the slides that I shared in the chat, so that you and your students can access these. The next thing, this is an article that Dr. Ayers wrote, which was sort of the impetus for the Valley of the Shadow project. And so this might be something for your high school students, perhaps to read an excerpt of, or for you to read for your own background knowledge. But it really kind of gives you a good background on what Dr. Ayers was thinking as he was developing this project. So it starts off with the introduction. It's got a kind of a summary of his argument, the close analysis of 2 communities, and then gets a little bit into some of his teaching methods and the ways that he was developing these maps using very early GIS. So I think, this is a really great website, a great tool that's sort of the beginnings, the early stages of how he put the Valley of the Shadow together. We don't talk a lot about historiography in K-12, but then students certainly do encounter it when they get into undergrad. So we are now producing videos on our YouTube channel where we, in the last session, Josh talked about contextualization and other words that previously we probably saved till college. But I feel like we do our kids a disservice when we think, oh, middle school and high school kids can't handle this. I think it's important to go ahead and start exposing them. At least they start hearing words that are, academic historians are using, so that when they do, if they choose to pursue higher education, then they at least have a little bit of an inkling of what that is and how it might help them further their understanding of the past. All right, let me hop back over the slides. I don't want to make sure I don't jump around too much. So we tried really hard to build on the background of the Valley of the Shadow with some of our digital maps. So the Digital Scholarship Lab that produced that very early digital version of the Pollen Atlas, we also create digital maps that are highly interactive that you can use with your students. All of our maps are OER. We also give away all of our data for free. So if you want to pull any of the shape files, if you're into GIS and making your own maps, we give all of the data information away with proper citations, as long as you don't monetize it in any way. And the only thing we ask is that we don't see anything on sites like Teachers Pay Teachers. But this is an infographic. Many of our maps on the American Panorama Atlas, which is the digital atlas that we built at the Digital Scholarship Lab at Richmond, start off with this graphic. And In Virginia, we have a new data science course that's being piloted next year in several high schools across the state. And then the following year, it will be available to all high schools as an elective under CTE. So we are teaching kids about how different types of public records and data is visualized. So I think these types of infographics showing kids what are the types of tools you're about to encounter before they go out into a live map is really important. They're learning bubble plots in math classes. Why not apply it to history? They're learning about timelines. Why not apply it to history? They're learning about primary sources. Let's embed primary sources directly into these digital resources. So those are the types of projects that we are trying to engage students in. So I'm gonna show you the live map. There's that wonderful infographic, and then they get into the map. So this is a map of forced migration. The areas in blue are showing where people were leaving, and the areas in the orangey copper color are the areas where people are migrating towards. And it gives you a little bit of historical context when you look at the timeline down here along the bottom. And as each decade, as you slide across the decades, you will see the data change and you will see the map change. So students can kind of see, as we were going from the early 1800s close to the time of the conflict of the Civil War, what was going on economically, what was going on socially, as more and more humans were being imported and almost immediately exported into states farther west. Because here in Virginia, I mean, if you look at this bar, as I go through each decade, unfortunately, part of our ugly history is that we were the largest human traffickers in the United States at the time, by far. And as sugar and cotton became the main cash crop and tobacco no longer became a viable crop, the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia were bringing people in and almost immediately moving them towards sugar plantations, particularly in Louisiana, and cotton plantations all across the South. But data is important, but putting that human face on it. So we also embed primary sources in the form of these narratives. Many of them were taken from oral histories or later on diaries and letters, so that students through each decade, I'm going to go back here to the 20s, as they're clicking on stories, I'm going to click on one here, they can read the stories of the people who were being impacted the most, which were the enslaved population. And so they can get a little bit of context there for what was going on from the people who were experiencing it firsthand. So I think putting that human narrative along with the data is really important. So kids, their eyes can kind of gloss over when they see data, but when they know that these are real human beings' lives we're talking about, I think they tend to want to learn a little bit more. It means something more when the storytelling. I can't remember who it was in the last session who taught elementary school, and she said she uses a lot of storytelling and she looks for patterns. Well, that's what we're trying to do with these maps. So this was one of the early maps that was made, and the software, the GIS software, wasn't as sophisticated. This was probably made about 8 years ago. So I want to kind of show you how far along we've come with the cartography and the more modern versions of the GIS. This is presented as story map. Dr. Ayers' last book, Southern Journey, was looking exactly at what we were just talking about, patterns, migration patterns, and telling the stories of migration from 1790 all the way up to 2020. And we kind of divide into 3 chunks, and there are 3 separate learning resources to bring these time periods to life. But I want you to look at just how far the cartography has come along and how much it greatly enhances the storytelling capabilities. If you've never used the GIS story maps, Esri gives that software away for free. Every K-12 school in the United States can get a free Esri account. They can get access to really industry level software that big corporations like Amazon pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to have access to, and they give it away. They're not dumb. They're trying to train their future workforce. They're trying to get us, the K-12 teachers, to do it for them. But I think it's a great way to prepare kids for the workforce, and it's a powerful tool for inquiry and storytelling. So as you scroll through the story map, you can add text, you can add images, you can add flat maps like this, but you can also animate. So think about that forced migration map, the blue and the copper, but look at now at just how vivid and how you can animate it to show those patterns. So in this story map for all 3 time periods, we're alternating largely between the Black and white population. Blue is where people are leaving, white is where they're moving to. But just look at how much better the software how far it's come along. It's a very powerful storytelling tool. They have these slider tools built in where your students can compare and contrast. So there's Black and white population for that particular decade. And then Dr. Ayers has embedded some content from the book. We also give a nod to the older project. If kids want to dig deeper, particularly into the enslaved population, we make it really easy for them to just link right into it through the story map. And then we continue on with the story. And there are 3, I love this animation showing kids about the Trail of Tears. You know, kids see it on a flat map. It doesn't really mean as much as when they see how, when it's animated over time, how people were constantly being forced off their land and pushed farther and farther west. We're going to revisit a couple of elements of this a little bit later on. Another one, if you teach civics or government, this is looking at the House of Representatives. So this is every House of Representatives election from 1840 to 2018. Does anybody want to guess why we do not have the 2020 presidential or the 2020 or 2022 midterm elections? This is just the House of Representatives. But does anyone want to guess why the last 2 election cycles are not on the map? We have any takers in the chat, Josh?
No. I'm going to guess, is it still, because are they technically still hung up in courts?
Yep, you got it.
All right.
There's still 2 court cases pending. So technically the results, even though the president is halfway through his first term, and so are members of the House, several people, the election is still not certified in 2 places in the United States. One of them is in Arizona. I cannot remember the other one off the top of my head. So until those cases are 100% resolved, the elections will not technically be certified. But this is a map you can use as a cartogram or a map. Students can drill down in Tennessee. You can see now currently in the 2018, there was only 1 or 2 places that went blue. The rest of most of your state went red. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that blue one just because it's sort of an outlier. And you'll see here, there's a slider tool similar to the forced migration map. And students can go back through time and look at how different districts voted, right? That this particular district has been historically blue. Why does that district not have any data from before 1942? If we have any civics or government teachers, I prefer them to answer. How come Tennessee 6 stops at 1942?
If I'm not mistaken, I think that's when it was created.
Exactly. So redistricting. So here's a way that you can get into that discussion about redistricting and gerrymandering. And we have separate lessons that go, we have a basic lesson that teaches kids how to use the map. And then we have another one that's more sophisticated on gerrymandering and redistricting. You can double click on any district, it'll zoom in, and then you can look at the district over time. And you can see that this has always been a blue district. Right? That particular, this is a different one than the one we just looked at a minute ago, except for 2 or 3 places where they flip to red. But you can look at those patterns. Someone mentioned patterns in the last section. So you can look and see over time how that Tennessee 6 voted, how Tennessee 7 voted. So it was Republican for a long time. Then it had a long stretch where it was Democratic, and then it went red again, and so on. So as you go through the different districts, you can look for those patterns over time. You can also look at who was the winner, right? And this is back in 1866 when the United States was smaller. We can go back to 1902. We can go back to 1938, 1970, and you can also do the strength of the victory. Was it a landslide or was it a close race? And the F, the letter F that you see every once in a while, that was a flip district, meaning in that particular election cycle, see how it flipped from blue to red. So lots of different ways for students to look at patterns, and then you can have them research, well, who is Kenneth J. Robinson and how did he get 61% of the vote? What was going on in that district in Tennessee that caused them to flip? And that's where you can pull your local history and your government and civics in. Foreign-born population. And again, think about all these data visualizations. How would you use this in a computer science class? How is data being visualized? How are primary sources being brought in? All of these are based on election data, census data. So you're using primary sources as the data that you're analyzing on the map. But instead of just giving kids a picture of a page out of a census report, here's a way to visualize it and let kids interrogate it and investigate it in a more interactive way. Josh, what county do you live in Tennessee?
I am in Knox. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted.
Okay.
I'm in Knox.
I'm going to click on Knox, Tennessee. Now, this map just got updated 3 months ago because there were also lawsuits pending over the 2020 census. But they did finally resolve the last of those lawsuits right before winter break. So our guys worked really hard over winter break to update this map for us. So does it surprise you, Josh, that your largest immigrant population in the 2020 census came from Mexico?
No.
All right. And then India, China, Guatemala, and Iraq are your next largest immigrant population.
The Iraq one would be the biggest one. India, China, that doesn't surprise me either because of Oak Ridge here in the university.
All right. And I'm wondering if you guys are seeing the same thing in your K-12 schools, those of you that teach in the same vicinity. You can put your county or your city or town, your students can do that. If you have a large EL population, kids love putting in their own location. And then I've had so many kids have a discussion. They say, well, here's where I came from, right? Because these tendrils are showing you where people came from as they immigrated to certain places. So back in 2010, it was still Mexico, but it was China was your number 2. If you go back to 2000, it was Mexico and then India. If you go back to, slide over one more, 1990, India. So somewhere between 1990 and 2000 is where all of a sudden Mexico, which wasn't even in your top 5, became your largest immigrant population. So that's a huge jump. They weren't even in the top 5 10 years earlier. So let's go back, and it gives you a little bit of context. You know, what was it about? It says in 1990, the number of foreign born from Mexico dwarfed that of any other individual country, right? It was mainly concentrated. If we were to look at Texas, you know, they would probably tell a very different story, but by large, right? But now it's seeping into other parts of the United States, not just along the Mexican border. So there's a whole discussion you have about immigration. There's a whole discussion you can have about, you know, where people came from, why did they come? You know, what are different reasons that people migrate? Where do they go? Is it based on where family members are located, where they can get a job? Are they leaving because they feel unsafe where they were, because they don't have any economic opportunities, they can't provide for their family? What is the reasons? What are the push-pull factors? All those things can be explored using this census data and looking for patterns. We mentioned earlier the Backstory is a podcast that Dr. Ayers hosted. We have rebuilt that archive. When I put in Thin Light, as in Thin Light of Freedom, which was Ed's book based on the Valley of Shadow, this is a really great episode where Ed, who is one of the hosts of the podcast, is interviewed by his fellow co-host, Brian Bello, about his book when it came out. So there's that whole hour-long episode, but then we also have it divided up into chunks, and there are other episodes that have something to do, you know, with that. We could also just put in Civil War. And it's going to give you a whole new set of results. This was an episode they did on the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, but we've got each individual chunk. So this is, you know, here's the whole hour. But then you can also, as you scroll down, you can see, you know, shorter sections of some of those episodes. So if you don't have time to use the whole thing, here's an 11-minute clip, right? Instead of a whole hour. Here's a 6-minute clip. Here's a 16-minute clip. Here's a 7-minute clip. So those are things that it gives you a unique URL when you hit share, and you can plug that right into your Canvas course or Schoology or Google Classroom or Blackboard, whatever you're using. The other place where you can find this content is Bunk. Bunk is our current events tool. And so here we have that backstory episode on the thin light of freedom. If it's an audio piece of content, you're going to be able to play it right within the Bunk platform. It's a video, there'd be a player and it would play right from there. All of our digital maps that I've been sharing with you, plus many, many more that we've made are in Bunk. They'll give you the transcript. They'll give you a link back to the original. But the way that Bunk works, and I'm going to kind of come out to the original page. Every day we have 6 or 7 University of Richmond students who work with Tony Field, who's our Bunk editor. He used to be the Backstory podcast editor and producer, and Ed kind of stole him away from Backstory because he knew he was going to wrap that up in about a year, and he had Tony come on board and help him build Bunk. And the idea behind Bunk is to show how everything happening today is connected to everything that's happened in the past. Does anybody want to guess where the name Bunk came from? It actually has a historical context.
I'm going to say I have no idea.
All right. There's an old Henry Ford quote that says all of history is bunk, and the only history that means a tinker's dam is the history we make today. So it's actually kind of an ironic little nod to this Henry Ford quote about all of history is bunk, meaning nonsense or, not important. It's only what we're doing today in the now. And so every day our students are curating newspaper articles, magazine articles, professional journals, podcasts, digital data visualizations, maps, anything that is out there in the public media about history, and then they link it through this elaborate tagging system. The first time Ed showed me Bunk, before he ever hired me to work with him, I said, this looks like a nerd Pinterest board. And I don't think he thought that was as funny as I did. He didn't know what Pinterest was, so I had to show him what it was. And he said, well, that seemed like a big waste of time, which made me laugh. But then he said, but I guess Bunk does sort of look like that. So if you click on any, I'm going to do the one about the phonograph. Before we had the audio excerpt from Ed's interview about his book. Here we get an article that was a Medium post. On the right, you see this deck of cards and you see these icons in the middle. Those icons change based on what we picked. If I had picked something else, if I go back out here and pick something about Ain't I Some Pumpkins, okay, you're looking at a primary source document here and an article about it. Abraham Lincoln received in a letter. So you're looking at primary source and you see 4 different icons. So depending on what you pick, you're going to have a variety of ways to make those historical connections. When you click on view connection, it's going to give you all the different tags that show what these 2 pieces of content have in common. I'm going to go back to Ed's article, since we were talking about the Civil War and the Valley of the Shadow. So let's see what it connects to. It connects to another excerpt that Ed published from the book as a Bunk original, which is just a way of doing essays. So they both have something to do with Augusta County, which is the place in the South. Stanton is in Augusta County, and it also has something to do with Virginia. So this is an excerpt from The Thin Light of Freedom, which is a book that the Valley of Shadow is based on, talking about the Augusta County during the Civil War. Then it gets into other articles that have been published about the Valley of the Shadow. Then it gets into an article about the birthplace of American slavery and Nat Turner. And you see how the tags can change. If we did place, if I go back out to the original source and I pick topic instead, you're going to get a whole different set of connections. Now the kids can drill down and see Civil War. Well, what else is in Bunk about the Civil War? There's 487 pieces of content that have something to do with the term American Civil War. You can click on individual tags, Confederate States of America, drilling down to something more specific. There's 153 pieces of content just on the Confederacy. We just added this way, Bunk, mapping out the articles in Bunk to see spatially where people talking about, a particular term or a tag. So it's not just that we have 153 pieces of content about the Confederacy. Here's all the places where we have articles discussing the Confederacy.
Annie,
right?
so someone asked, what's the general reading level of some of these resources on Bunk?
So I would say Bunk is more high school, but if you're teaching middle school, There are, we have immersive reader built into our learning resources, but it's not built into Bunk. Many of the journals and articles that we tag out to have that audio reader built in. A lot of the New York Times articles automatically have that built in. So wherever you see an audio recorder, then if you scroll down to any excerpt, you can go back to the original source. And many times you'll see an audio plug there where they will have an audio reader, not every article, but see here where it says listen. So sometimes
This perspective piece was written by Grant Stanton.
So some of them have an audio player built into them. It just depends on the publication. There's also a free tool called Rewordify where I can take this article. I'm just going to take a couple of paragraphs just for the demo purposes. It's called Rewordify, and I put this the directions for this in my learning resources. You go to Rewordify and you plug it in, and it rewrites the passage for you with a little bit easier text. So there was your original, and here it is where they kind of help the kids and give them a little scaffolding so they can read it. So that's a free tool that I recommend. There's another one called WordTune or WordTune Read that is a new tool, and it doesn't work with every website, but it works with many websites. So if you were to go into Bunk and find an article, you could download WordTune Read, and it would also give you a summary on the right-hand side that pops up depending on which periodical or journal you're looking at. So there are free apps out there that help you scaffold or rewrite it if your district doesn't pay for a more expensive program like Newsela. That's a great question. Yeah. All right, so those are just kind of our greatest hits, so to speak, that I wanted to share with you just to give you an idea of some of the tools and resources that we've been dabbling in and playing with. But I do want to spend the majority of the rest of the time that we have left actually showing you the Valley of the Shadow and how it works. So this is the original Valley of the Shadow that was on the library of the UVA library. It's still there. The original project is still there, but as Josh said, it's very antiquated. It's not the easiest site to navigate, but this is the original site that Dr. Ayers built with several undergrad students for 4.5 years. Every semester, a new batch of students would enroll in his class, and they would immediately become part of this project. And this is the 30th anniversary of the project. Last November, they had a special digital humanities convening honoring the 30th anniversary of the Valley of the Shadow, and several former students came back. Dr. Ayers was there. Many of them are now engaged in work in a history-related field. So, for example, one of the students that worked on the original project is now the head of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Several of them are history professors or deans at different colleges around the country. 4 of his former students are now university presidents like he was. So it's a pretty impressive list of students, and many of them talk about how working on this project in their early college career is what got them hooked on history and made them want to make this their life's work and made them feel differently about the types of tools and resources and ways that we engage with history. So, you know, this one project really has had this ripple effect all across a lot of different content areas. Many of them are working in museum work and that sort of thing. So, you know, you can see this looks like an old website. It's definitely dated. You can go to letters and you can search for keywords. I'm going to put sun. Let's just see what it comes up with the word son. So here are all the different letters that mention someone's son, right? Your son's going off to war. So it could be sons writing back to their mothers or their girlfriends or fathers or siblings or that sort of thing. But these are all transcriptions of letters. And here's the you know, the transcribed version of the letter. And the students did all this work, right? Incredible amount of work. But it's clunky, it's old, it's slow. So the new version, let's see if I can get back there. I have it open. So there it is. Our version, you can explore the Valley. We also kind of did an update about the project, kind of telling people how it started, sort of the history of the project, linking back to the original archive version. and then talking about how we added, new search capabilities for a modern age and a new generation of learners. So it's divided into 3 areas: the eve of war, the war years, and then the aftermath, which are the same time periods that the original, that we had in there. When you go into Explore the Valley, they're kind of presented. There's a little nod with the same little icons there, which was the poplar forest image from the original. So I'm going to go into the eve of war, and then it's sort of a choose your own adventure. Do you want to interrogate newspapers? Do you want to look through letters and diaries, census records, church records, the Black Registry, fire insurance policies, or tax records? So my students, by large, their favorite thing to do was to read other people's mail. I mean, who doesn't like to, look at other people's personal thoughts and diaries and letters? And so you can pick, do I just want to look at Augusta County first, and then Franklin County, which is up in Pennsylvania? And so here are all the letters that, we have for people living in those counties. You can also go and do a more, you can do both. So if I want to search for the word son again, right? If I want to do a location, I could do a specific city or town. Maybe I just want to do Augusta County. I can turn it on or off, or I can type Augusta County in here. I want to do the keyword. So I'm going to put miss you and see if I get a hit. Nope. So I'm going to go back. Maybe I need to not narrow my search down so much. I'm going to take that out. So now I'm just looking for the word son. And here are all the different letters that mention the word son. All right. Some of them are coming up with Freedmen's Bureau's records. Some of them are talking about a statement that someone gave. And you'll see, when you click on that, here's a letter, and we've got the original. So the kids will see how people spelled things, how they may have not had the best grammar, but then you'll also get the modern spelling, the transcription. That way, if the kids don't understand something on the original, it'll help translate it over here for them. So it's a lot easier to read. It also gives them the original source where that came from, like a citation down here at the bottom. It gives them keywords that they can search for, and then they can go back out and select another letter. So a lot of times students would follow someone like, okay, John Klein, or Andrew Febby Leach, or Thomas Jackson. They would see everything that they could find from that one person. So they would search for that, that person and find out, well, what else do you have about him or his family? They hyperlink into other people. So here it mentions someone named Dorcas Waite. Here's Mr. Burdett. So, kids could go back in and say, okay, well, what else do we know about Mr. Burdett? So maybe we go into a different era and look at letters and diaries and see if some of these same people are in there. Let's see if there's anything for Mr. Burdett in the next. Okay, there's one entry here. And here's a letter. So the kids can scroll down. So they can follow people's journey through the letters. They can also take that same person and investigate it through diaries. What happened to them after the war. They can search for that person in the newspapers. So if I do a search by newspaper, is Mr. Burdett in the newspaper? Nope, he's not in the newspaper. What if we look for the word son in the newspaper archives? Lots of entries in the newspaper. So there's articles about mothers and sons, or someone's son. There's letters, there's diaries. So having kids follow keywords, having them follow people, having them follow events through each of these different time periods, they can kind of piece things together rather than just looking at the Civil War only as a list of battles to memorize and a list of generals to memorize and that sort of thing. So it puts a human face on the war, and it also gets them using archives, using letters, using diaries. Now, you're probably thinking, well, this is great if you live in Pennsylvania or Virginia, but many people have used this archive as a jumping off point to kind of show people, students in particular, how you can access public records and use them to learn about the past. So what you can then turn around with your students is have them just as Dr. Ayers did with his students, going through public records between Stanton, Virginia and Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, in Augusta County, Virginia, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania, you can then work with your local historical society and have them learn how they can pull records and find out, well, what was happening in Tennessee at that time. So you could build your own mini Valley of the Shadow project, maybe just picking 1 or 2 people. Maybe you pick, 2 soldiers, one in East Tennessee, one in West Tennessee, or something like that, and let them do it. We did that with Richmond. We pulled archives when I taught in Richmond, Virginia. We worked with local libraries and our local historical society and students. We went out to a Confederate cemetery and looked at some names on the tombstones, and then they looked for records for those people. So those are just some different ways that we've done it with that. I'm going to show you the learning resources. So we have a teacher version for all of our learning resources, which includes national standards. We don't usually link out to individual state standards, with the exception of there's a couple of lessons that we did that are specific to Virginia. So we did link to the Virginia standards, but normally we link out to the Common Core, the C3 framework, National Council for Social Studies, the geography standards, AP, if it's appropriate, and then the EAD roadmap, which iCivics had released 2 years ago, that is looking at civics standards on a national scale. So we link out to the standards. Kids don't care about the standards. That's not for them. And then this Read for Understanding piece, we put teaching tips for the teachers. So we explain to you the different types. There's Word, Tune, Read, and Rewordify. The different pedagogy strategies. So we're using Turn and Talk here. We link out to things like the Civil War Museum. So it gives you a link so you can look at their resources, the video, that sort of thing. So any tools or strategies that we're using are linked in there and tells you a little bit about how the lesson was assembled. After that, it pretty much looks the same as the kid version. So we give you a whole separate kid version. Poof, it's navy blues and it says students at the top instead of educators, so you know you're in the right place. This is the URL that you would embed in your Canvas course, your Google Classroom, your Blackboard, or whatever. Here's the immersive reader, like I mentioned. So if you have students that are English language learners, it will read the lesson to them. They can use a picture dictionary for certain words. They can change the rate of speed. They can only look at a few lines at a time. If they have a reading disability, oftentimes that's helpful to them. They can change the size of the font. So we tried to think of every piece that we could. If there's a video, they're all closed caption for hearing impaired students or for students with processing needs. So the immersive reader is a great tool, but the students don't need the standards. We do put the vocabulary. Instead of teaching tips here, we just give them a quick little introduction to what the lesson is going to be about, and then it hops right into the inquiries. So again, anything they need is embedded right in there. You won't have to watch annoying YouTube ads. We have our own video player embedded right here. It links out to whatever the kids need. So that you don't have to link a million things. You just put that one link. Here, the kids are going to go look at the old version of Valley of the Shadow. Then they're going to look at the new version. So everything's linked in there. If we use a Jamboard or slides, or we talk about having kids work with a partner, if, some people are still doing virtual teaching. Some people have a whole virtual high school separate from the in-person school. We tried to think of different ways. So if you're working remotely, here's some suggested technologies you can use for kids to do this part of the lesson. But everything they need is built right within there. We use the 5Es inquiry model, but we've modified it slightly. We don't get into the evaluation piece because all 50 states have different evaluation requirements. So we added the extend and elaborate. We broke those out into separate E's in the 5Es inquiry model. But everything they need, the inquiry-based questions, the images they're going to analyze, the links out to whatever you want them to do, all the activities, we put step-by-step directions. We add arrows so they don't get lost on what they're supposed to be clicking on. Here's how you find everything you need to successfully navigate the website. Sometimes teachers will send part of this home as part of like a flipped classroom, do this part at home, and then we're going to do the rest of it in class, or we're going to talk about it tomorrow. So we give them step-by-step directions. So really they could work with a partner and go through this on their own, or you could do it step by step. You know your kids the best. You might not have time to do all these activities, so pick 1 or 2 or 3 that you like. But we kind of walk you through all the different ways for kids to search and the different capabilities that the lesson has. Let's hop back to our slides here, see what we missed. I put some other images in there just that you can use. Feel free to take these slides and make a copy of them. If you want to teach the kids how to use the Valley, I gave you some slides that kind of show step by step all the different features. So that if you want to use that, you may. If you only have 10 minutes, let them look at bunk and make one connection. If you have 15, let them listen to a segment of the podcast. You have 20 minutes, let them explore one of the maps. If you have a half an hour, we have a PBS series called The Future of America's Past. Each of those has separate learning resources. If you've got more time, do a whole 5 E's and pilot it and give us some feedback. There's a feedback form at the bottom of all these things. We're building these for you. These are made for teachers. We hope they're useful. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see if there's any questions, but everything that we make and create is an OER, open educational resource. So as long as you use a citation and you're only using it for instruction, you're not monetizing anyway, we're delighted for you to share this with your friends. If something doesn't work right, email me. My contact information is on the slides. If you like it, please share it widely. If you don't, let me know how we can fix it and make it better, because I'm a teacher like the rest of you. We want these to be high quality resources that will make your load a little bit lighter, not make it more difficult. So I'll stop there. Anybody have any thoughts or questions or how you might use one of the resources or tools that we shared tonight?
Again, if you want to type in the chat, I will read it. Or of course you can turn on your cameras and talk, or just unmute or whatever. I put the link in the chat again in case any of you came in after it was originally posted. I'll put it on the TCSS website. So if you're ever like, where did that go again? Just know that you can come, you heard it at TCSS, you can come back to TCSS to get it.
Absolutely.
And yeah.
And I can zoom into your class. I can walk them through a part of the lesson. I can walk them through one of those maps. I can walk them through how bunk works. I zoom into classes all the time. And we don't charge for any of our trainings or any of the resources. Well, thanks for the opportunity to come tonight. I can stick around if anybody has a question, or if you're watching this virtually later on, feel free to reach out if you have questions. My email's on the bottom of the slides, and we would love to know your thoughts and see how you might explore some of these resources.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to hit end here.